can. All right, yeah. So you can always get that later. Okay, so let me share the screen. Just 1 second. Okay. So I hope my screen is visible to all of you. For those of you who have been attending regularly, you would remember that we've completed 8 chapters of the book of Romans, and we started chapter 9 last week. We only did half of it, and today we'll do the rest of it. And so just to kind of remind us and refresh our memory into what we are doing in the book of Romans, remember we had said that Paul had kind of divided. Paul didn't do it intentionally, but we find different sections in the book. As Paul is writing this letter to the church at Rome, there are these different sections that we find in the book. The first 3 chapters talk about the sinfulness of mankind. Chapters 4 and 5 talk about that fact that salvation is only through Jesus Christ. And then 6 to 8 talked about living a life of faith. So we looked at these 8 chapters where it begins with the sinfulness of mankind, salvation through Jesus Christ, and then living a life of faith. And then last week, we started with chapter 9, where we are actually looking at the failure of Israel to respond to the gospel, resulting in God opening the way to the Gentiles. So we will look at that, for the next few weeks as well, till we complete chapter 11. And then finally, from chapter 12 to 16, we will be looking at the practical outworking of God's great plan of salvation. Okay, so the book has these beautiful sections. Each section has such an important message that God wanted each of us to hear. Okay, now since we started from chapter 9, so we are in this section now, 9 to 11. Last week only I had mentioned about the fact that even as we are looking at these just 1 second. Okay, so last week only I had mentioned that even as we are looking at chapters 9 to 11, to keep in mind that this actually talks about Israel. The fact that Israel, whom God selected, whom God chose, but Israel actually rejected that God. Okay, so when you look at chapter 9, Paul is actually talking about Israel's, the Jewish people's, past election. The fact that God chose them. Was there anything good in the Israelites? Was there anything? There was nothing good about them. In fact, they were not even a nation. The person that God first called was Abraham. And when you look at Abraham, we recognize Abraham used to worship different, deities. He was an idol worshiper. And God tells them, listen, Abraham, I am calling you. And as I am calling you, I will make you into a great nation. So when you look at Abraham's selection, and through Abraham, you look at the entire Jewish nation, you recognize that there was nothing praiseworthy about them, but God elected them out of his grace. But even as we look at past election, in chapter 10 that we will look at next week, we are looking at the present rejection. When we look at now, we see that the Israelites have rejected the Messiah, not just now, but for the last 2000 years. Most of Israel has rejected the Messiah. Yes, there are a few messianic Jews, those who believe in Jesus Christ. They have experienced salvation in Jesus Christ by faith through grace, but you recognize that the majority of the Israelites have rejected Christ. But when you look at chapter 11, it's amazing because God has not forgotten the Israelites. You recognize that there is a future restoration of the people of Israel, of the Jewish people. So a lot of people believe that the church has actually replaced Israel. Okay, now there are verses that sometimes do point out to the fact that the church has replaced Israel. But then when you look at chapters like chapter 11, you recognize that God has not rejected the Israelites, that the church has not replaced the nation of Israel, that God still has a special plan for the people of Israel. And so there is a future restoration. Okay, so it's very important for us to understand this, in the dynamic, this dynamic in God's future plan and his kingdom. So chapter 9 talks about the past election, then 10 talks about the present rejection, and 11 will talk about the future restoration. Now let's look from chapters 19 to 21. Let me read this first, and then I'll do a little recap of what we did in the previous verses. One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? For who is able to resist his will? But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use? Now, when you look at verses 19 and 20, we need to remember what Paul said in the previous verses. Okay, and just to refresh your memory, I'll summarize what Paul mentioned in the previous verses. Paul basically talked about how the Jewish people were elected, right? And so God says, God brings this comparison, the fact that God chose Moses and God chose Pharaoh, but God was the one who hardened Pharaoh's heart, right? And so the Bible in verses 17, 18 talks about the fact that God chooses to have mercy on who he has mercy. God chooses to harden somebody's heart if he wants to harden the person's heart. Okay, so it's basically depending on God whether he wants to have mercy on you or whether he wants to harden your heart. Like for Moses and the Jewish people, though there was nothing good about them, yet God elected them, God chose them to be his own people. And Pharaoh, who was just like the Jewish people, just like Moses, there probably was nothing good in him. What did God do? God hardened his heart. Okay, so what Paul is saying in chapter 19, he's saying that, listen, it is God who decides if he wants to harden somebody's heart or if he wants to have mercy on someone. It is God who decides whether he chooses to love Jacob or he chooses to hate Esau. Who are we to ask that question? Okay, now because Paul talks about the choice of God, where God decides what he wants to do, then in verse 19, Paul says, now one of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? Whereas if God is hardening our heart, why is he still blaming us? Okay, it is his power. Who are we to resist him? Okay, and so because of this kind of a question, this kind of a rhetoric that happens in verse 20, Paul reminds the people who we are. He says, listen, who are you? You are just a human being to talk back to God. Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use, right? So what is Paul saying here? Paul is saying, listen, maybe you don't like the way God is operating. Maybe you don't like the way the fact that he's hardening somebody's heart, but he's also in the other way having mercy on whom he chooses to have mercy. Maybe you don't like how he operates, but who are you to ask this question back to God? Now, what Paul is saying, Paul is not saying that we cannot question God. Because when you look at Psalms is full of questioning to God. Okay, the psalmists are questioning God because they don't understand some things. Look at the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk is full of questions about, the prophet Habakkuk is asking questions to God. You look at Jesus on the cross, again quoting Psalm 22, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? So please remember, in verses 19 to 21, it is not like Paul is discouraging us from asking questions to God, but Paul is helping us to understand a very, very deep meaning. Why? Because Paul is comparing God to a potter and we like a clay. And so the first thing that Paul is actually telling us that we need to remember in verse 19 and 21 is, number one, the limitation of our own judgment. See, we don't even understand what the future is. We don't know what tomorrow will hold. Now, God knows everything. God is the only one who knows human history because he's out of human history. He's above human history. He's beyond human history. He's the Alpha and the Omega. God knows. So because God knows the future, God knows the beginning, God knows the end. That is the reason in his judgment, he's having, mercy on somebody who chooses to have mercy, and he's basically hardening somebody's heart whom he chooses to harden. Okay. Now, what Paul is saying is, listen, we don't have to ask these questions to God. Why do you work like this? Why? Because there is a limitation to our judgment. We are not able to judge things. We are not able to judge situations the way God is able to. Why? Because he knows time inside out. We don't know. We don't even know what will happen the next hour. So Paul is saying, listen, don't ask questions about why God is working like this. Why is he loving Jacob? Why is he hating Esau? Don't ask. Why? Because there's limitation to our judgment. The second thing that Paul is, encouraging us to do with this, he's saying, listen, trust his plan. When God decided to harden Pharaoh's heart, it's not like God had something against Pharaoh, but God actually wanted to show his power and glory, not just to the Egyptians, but also to the Jewish people. Why? Because for all these years, hundreds of years, the Jewish people were under slavery. Moses came in the name of this God saying that, listen, this God has sent me. He will free you guys. He will redeem all of you. And the Israelites would not believe it. So what is Paul saying? Paul is saying, listen, you have to trust God's plan. There was a purpose why God did that. He's the potter. We are the clay. When he makes vessels, some are for noble purposes, some are for ordinary purposes. So why is Paul telling us not to question the way God works? Number one, because there is limitation of our judgment. Two, Paul is telling us, please trust his plan. His plans are the best. There is always a purpose that he has. So just trust his plan. And the third thing that he says is, for us, we have to be obedient to him. I'll give you Moses as example, right? Because since Paul also gives, Pharaoh and Moses as examples. See, God had always told Moses that, I will send you to Pharaoh, but I will harden his heart. I will harden his heart. Why? So that my glory may be revealed. When you look at Genesis, when you look at all these, chapters, you will recognize that is what God is telling Moses. Listen, I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that, my glory will be displayed. Now, when Moses went to Pharaoh the first time, the second time, the third time, Pharaoh made it very difficult for the Jewish people. Okay, if you read the time when the Exodus happens, when Moses went to Pharaoh, Pharaoh actually got very angry with the Jewish people. And so what did Pharaoh punish them with? Pharaoh said, listen, all of you Jewish slaves, you will have to produce the same amount of brick, but I will not provide the straw. You will need to go and get the straw yourself. I will not supply the straw. You find the straw, but you need to give the exact amount of brick. Okay, so that was more punishment. And Moses knew that God was hardening Pharaoh's heart. But it's interesting, in spite of everything, Moses was obedient to God. Even though God was hardening Pharaoh's heart, what did Moses do? Moses kept his mouth shut and was obedient to God. 9 plagues happened. God kept hardening Pharaoh's heart. God kept hardening Pharaoh's heart. Finally, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh said, okay, all of you just go, get out of my presence. I don't want anything to do with you. Moses took all of the Israelites, the Jewish people, and left Egypt. But midway, we all know that Pharaoh again changed his mind. And then Pharaoh again wanted to attack them. So you had the Egyptian army behind them and you had the Red Sea in front of them. Again, it was a difficult situation. But what did Moses do? Moses just was obedient to God. He chose to obey God. Okay. So I think that is something that you and I need to remember. Listen, God chooses to have mercy on someone and he chooses to harden the hearts of the others. Now, what is my, response? My response is to not question him why he works like that, but my response is to be obedient to him, especially for those of us who have received his mercy. Listen, God could have hardened each one of our hearts, okay? A lot of us here, we ourselves have come from other faith background. God could have hardened our hearts, but God did not do that. What did God do? God chose to have mercy on us. So instead of questioning God and talking back to him, we need to understand the limitation of our own judgment. We need to trust his plan and we need to be obedient to him, just like Moses was obedient to him. So please remember, the problem that Paul is saying is not the fact that we cannot question God. We can obviously question God. But when you question God, please remember these 3 things that, Paul is trying to highlight through these verses. 1, our judgment is limited. Okay, it's flawed. It is not the correct judgment. Second, we need to trust his plan. Even though his plan may not seem just, even though his plan may not seem fair to us, we need to trust his plan because his plans and purposes will be fulfilled. And finally, just like Moses, we need to be obedient to him, keep our mouth shut and be obedient to him. Okay. So when you look at these verses, that is what Paul is saying, that God chooses to harden somebody's heart, but God chooses to have mercy on somebody's heart. Okay. Now let's look at the other verses, and it's very interesting what we learn from these verses. Verse 22. What if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath, prepared for destruction? What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory? Even us, whom he also called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. As he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one who's not my loved one. And in the very place where it was said to them, you're not my people, they will be called children of the living God. So when you look at these verses from 22 to 26, there are a few things that Paul is saying. Number one, he's bringing out a very beautiful thing. He says, listen, what if God is working the way he's working in human history so that he can show you and me mercy? Verse 23 says, what if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy? Who are the objects of his mercy? We are the objects of his mercy, right? Who, we are the ones who should have been, experiencing his wrath, or we are the ones who should have been experiencing his mercy. But what is God saying? God is saying, listen, all that has been happening in the past, hardening of Pharaoh's heart, everything that is happening in human history, Paul is saying, listen, what if God did everything so that he could reveal his glory to you and me, the Gentiles? Okay. And so when you understand that, it gives a very beautiful picture why God is working like that, that everything that God did, it may seem unjust, it may seem unfair, it may seem, incomprehensible. We don't understand, but Paul is saying, listen, what if he did all of that? The way history has happened, okay, exact events in history have happened. What if it has happened? Why? Because God wanted to make the riches of his glory known to you and me, who are the objects of his mercy, right? Whom he prepared in advance for glory. So you and I need to remember that. So what are some of the things that Paul is saying? Number one, Paul says, everything that has been happening in human history was done so that we could be saved. Now, that is the significance of human history. Okay, we celebrate Independence Day, right? In India, we celebrate Independence Day on the 15th of August. In 1947, India got independence, right? India became a free country. So what is Paul saying? Paul is saying, what if all of this happened so that you and I could receive his mercy? If it did not happen like that, what if you and I would not receive his mercy? So what is Paul saying? Paul is saying, listen, a lot of things in history we don't like. We ask questions, God, why did this happen? We ask questions, God, why did slavery happen? We ask questions, God, why did the world war happen? We ask God the question, God, why was my nation in bondage for all these years by a foreign ruler or by invaders? We may ask these questions to God, but what is Paul saying? Paul is saying, listen, what if everything happened in human history so that you and I could receive his mercy, that you and I could be saved? Okay, it changes our perspective on human history forever. Yes, there are things that we are not happy that God allowed to happen in this earth. Yes, there are things that are happening now that we are not happy that God allowed in this earth. Okay. Example, we are all in the midst of COVID, but remember that because of COVID, there are so many people who came to the saving knowledge of Christ. What if God allowed COVID to bring those people and make sure that they received his mercy? Okay. So Paul brings this beautiful aspect of human history. What if everything that has happened in human history was done so that we could be saved? Now, when I put myself in it, I'm like, wow, God, I'm so grateful that everything happened exactly the way it did in human history. For the last thousands of years, it has happened, but I thank you it has happened exactly like that, so that me and my family and my friends, we who are part of this, devotion, we who are part of this family, that we are saved and we experience his mercy. The second thing he says, that it was always God's plan to save us Gentiles. It's very beautiful. I've marked these, in yellow, especially verses 25 and 26. Paul says, he's basically quoting Hosea. I will call them my people who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one who's not my loved one. And then again in 26, he says, in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called children of the living God. Okay. Now, when you look at verses like this in Hosea, and also you remember, some of the Old Testament, verses, you recognize that it was always God's plan to save us Gentiles. Okay. When God calls Abraham, what did God say? This is the Abrahamic blessing. God says, listen, anyone who blesses you, I will bless them. Anyone who curses you, I will curse them. But through you, I will bless the nation. See, it was always God's plan to save us Gentiles. God did not just come up with a plan B because the Israelites refused to accept him or, acknowledge him. We are not his plan B. We were always his plan A. God always wanted to save us Gentiles. And as a result, what did he do? He hardened the hearts of the Israelites like he hardened the hearts of Pharaoh, so that this gospel now can reach us to Gentiles like us, and that we will receive his mercy. Okay. It's very beautiful when you try to understand all that has happened in history. Why? Because it was always God's plan to save us Gentiles, that you and I will share in the glory. Okay. And I find it very beautiful, and I hope that you find it beautiful as well. Everything that's happening in human history was done so that you and I individually, you personally, could be saved. Okay. Then from verses 27 to 33, and then I'll close with this section. Paul again quotes Isaiah. Isaiah cries out concerning Israel. Now, this is what, we need to remember, because the kind of the restoration of Israel you can see from here also in some of the Old Testament verses. Isaiah cries out concerning Israel. Though the number of the Israelites be like the sand by the sea, only the remnant will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence on earth with speed and finality. It is just as Isaiah said previously, unless the Lord Almighty had left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom, we would have become like Gomorrah. So when you look from verses 27 and 28, these verses talk about God's judgment on the Israelites. Why? Because the Israelites took their nationality, took their lineage, took their DNA, took their genetics for granted. They are all descendants of Abraham, so they took that for granted. But what is God telling in verses 27 and 28? God is saying, listen, I will carry out my sentence on earth with speed and finality. So 27, 28, God is actually talking about, his judgment against Israel. But when you look at 29, again, Isaiah, the same Isaiah is talking about his grace. What is it? He's saying, unless the Lord had left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom and we would have been like Gomorrah. Okay. Now, if God was so against the Israelites, he would have turned the Israelite nation like Sodom and Gomorrah. Nobody talks about Sodom and Gomorrah now, right? They don't even exist. They are nowhere in the map. But we know that the nation of Israel, it's a very wealthy nation. It's a very advanced nation when you look at technology. Why? Because Isaiah said, listen, it is the Lord Almighty who has left us descendants. God has not forgotten Israel. Yes, he's judging Israel now because Israel has rejected the election, but God has not forgotten them. So what is Isaiah saying? Isaiah is saying that, listen, the Lord has had mercy on us, and as a result, he's left us descendants. And like I said in chapter 11, it will be all the more clear what God intends to do with the Israelites. Okay, few lessons that we learn from here. Number one, okay, sorry, there are these verses as well. Let me read that then. What then shall we say? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it, a righteousness that is by faith, but the people of Israel who pursued the law as the way of righteousness have not attained their goal. Why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but as if it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, see, I lay in Zion a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall, and the one who believes in him will never be put to shame. Okay, so Jesus, who's the cornerstone, a lot of times this verse is actually referring to Jesus. But what is the Bible saying? Bible is saying, listen, the reason we Gentiles got a chance into God's kingdom because the Israelites tried to obtain righteousness by way of the law, whereas it should have been by way of the faith. Okay, but then again, in the last verse, God is saying, and the one who believes in him, Jesus, will never be put to shame. So again, you recognize that there is hope for the Jewish nation, right? There's hope for the Israelites because somehow they will start putting their faith on Jesus, just the way you and I have put our faith on Jesus. Why? Because God chose to have mercy on us. Similarly, he will extend his mercy to the Jewish nation, to the Israelites, when the final, number of Gentiles have come, which we'll see in chapter 11. After that, God will again reach out to the Jewish nation, work in their hearts, have mercy on them, and then, bring them to the saving knowledge of Christ. So what do we learn from the last few verses? Number one, the problem with Israel was that the Israelites took their selection for granted. Now, this is a lesson for us, okay? Now we have been saved. Please do not take our salvation for granted. The Israelites thought because God selected them, they could do anything they wanted. They could, become adulterers. They would be completely in rebellion against God. They took their selection for granted. And that is what these verses say, that was their problem. Second thing, the Israelites took the law for granted. Their actions became more important than attitude. Okay, so God gave them the law. And what did they do? Without even meaning anything, they would just follow the law and obtain the law. Okay, they would just follow it as rituals without even understanding the spirit of the law, without even checking on the attitude. And God says, listen, I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want your fasting. This is not what religion is to me. Why? Because they started taking the law for granted. Okay, now we can be in this danger as well. Okay, but the Israelites will believe in Jesus. And like I'm saying, when you come to chapter 11, you would recognize God's plan for Israel, how the whole nation of Israel will be restored. Listen, salvation is only possible through Jesus Christ. And what is Paul trying to say? Paul is saying, listen, the reason that you and I have chosen to follow Christ is not to our credit. It is because God decided to have mercy on us. If God would harden our hearts, then we would not follow Christ. Okay, like so many people, they hear the gospel, but they harden their heart. Why? Because God chose to harden their heart, but he's chosen to harden our, but he chose to have mercy on us. So just like he chose to have mercy on us, in the end days, later in time, God will again extend his mercy to the Jewish nation, to the Israelite nation, and they will, put their faith in Jesus Christ, and they will also be saved. And that is what it says, finally they will believe in Jesus Christ and they will be saved. Okay, beautiful chapter 9, for us to remember that, listen, maybe sometimes we don't like the way God operates. Why is God choosing to have mercy on me and not my best friend? Why is God choosing to have mercy on me and not, my neighbor? Why is God choosing to have mercy on me and not somebody that I dearly love? Why, God? This is not fair. But then, Paul is saying, listen, what if everything that has happened in history was so that you could be saved, so that you could receive that mercy of God? And that actually changes our whole perspective of why history happened and why God did like that. Okay. But when you look at it as the chapter ends, Paul very beautifully talks about, the Israelites, their problem was they took the selection for granted. We should not. And they took the law for granted. We should not. But we praise God that we already believe in Jesus Christ and our salvation is secured in him. And one day the Israelites will put their faith on this stone that could become a stumbling stone, but they will be saved because they will choose to put their faith in Jesus Christ. Okay, so that is what we'll do for today in chapter 9. We'll come back next week and we'll look at chapter 10 when we actually look how the Israelites rejected God and and some of the things that we look from chapter 10. So if you can read chapter 10 and come next week, that will be great. Let me just stop my screen share and I'll also stop recording.